Right from the start, before the war even broke out, Mogami's career started off badly. She would ultimately require 3 significant refits, which would cost millions and keep her out of commission for years. In addition to directly sinking 5 of her own ships, she rammed 2 heavy cruisers, resulting in their eventual sinking and becoming the victim of friendly fire herself. To round off her unfortunate career, her demise would be brought about by the detonation of 4 of her own torpedoes. Mogami, which slid down the slipways in March 1934, was the lead ship of her class of 4 ships. The Mogami had a crew of 850, a displacement of 13,500 tons, a top speed of 35 knots, 10 8-inch cannons, and 12 long lance torpedo launchers. Bad luck began right away. In her first deployment in late 1935, Mogami suffered typhoon damage due to poor welding. The crew found the hull had warped so badly they could not train her turrets. She was disarmed and drydocked for massive reconstruction. When war broke out, she was assigned to the assault on Malaya and Borneo. Her 8-inch guns covered landings in these invasions. Her next stop was Java, where she and Mikuma were covering the Japanese landing at Bantam Bay. Some 50 Japanese transports of various sizes were unloading troops. The American heavy cruiser Houston and the Australian light cruiser Perth, fleeing Java, came upon these targets and charged, hurling shells. Mogami, her sister ship Mikuma, the light cruiser Notori, and 10 destroyers all hurried to the scene in response to the Japanese transport's call for assistance. Mogami fired a spread of 6 torpedoes at the Allied ships. The salvo scored several hits, sinking 5 targets. Unfortunately, they were the Japanese Army landing ships. One of the Japanese transports was the Ryujo Maru, carrying Lieutenant General Imamura, commanding the 16th Army. He held onto a piece of driftwood for 20 minutes before being picked up by a passing boat. Given the already tense relations between the Army and Navy, the Imperial Navy decided it would be prudent to credit the sinkings to the USS Houston. General Imamura, being an Army man, was unaware that the Houston was not equipped with torpedoes. Houston and Perth were soon surrounded by Japanese warships and sank under a massive barrage of shells and torpedoes. 2 months after the raid into the Indian Ocean in April 1942, Mogami and 3 other heavy cruisers were tasked with conducting a nighttime bombardment of the American-held atoll of Midway prior to the planned Japanese invasion. After the Japanese carrier force was slaughtered on June 4, the bombardment mission scheduled for the next evening was allowed to go ahead anyway. They were 90 miles from Midway when sanity prevailed and ordered to withdraw. As the cruisers steamed homeward at 28 knots in the dim moonlight, escorted by 2 destroyers, a lookout spotted a surfaced submarine. The USS Tambor. During maneuvers designed to avoid a submarine attack, Mogami's bow knifed into the heavy cruiser Mikuma's port side, rupturing her fuel tank, leaving a trail of oil. Mogami's bow was reduced in length by 40 feet as a result of the impact, which caused it to fold in on itself. Mogami was only capable of 12 knots, and Mikuma was leaking oil. The 2 undamaged cruisers hurried on through the night, while both destroyers were detached to escort the damaged Mogami and Mikuma. Midway dispatched a squadron of 12 Vindicator bombers to conduct a low-level skip bombing attack at first light. No hits were recorded, but 1 Vindicator was set ablaze by Japanese flak. The flaming Vindicator slammed into the Mikuma's after turret. The impact started a fire on Mikuma that spread down the intake of the starboard engine room, igniting gas fumes, which reduced the ship's speed. The Japanese force was attacked the following day, on June 6, by 57 dive bombers escorted by 20 fighters from the carriers Enterprise and Hornet. Believing Mikuma to be a battleship, now that she was 40 feet longer than her sister, the aircraft concentrated heavily on her. Mikuma was severely impacted by the devastation brought on by the bombing. Unable to control the raging fires, the decision to abandon ship was made. Bombs also hit Mogami, knocking out her number 5 turret, damaging the torpedo tubes, and igniting fires below decks. Shortly after dusk, Mikuma sank, leaving Mogami to limp away with 191 casualties and 800 holes in her. Mogami sailed to the Truk naval base in the Caroline Islands battered and scorched. 5 weeks of repair work there made Mogami seaworthy enough to head for the Sasebo Navy Yard in Japan. The cruiser was repaired at the dockyard from August 1942 to April 1943, missing the entire Guadalcanal campaign. While in the drydock, Mogami had a major rebuild as Japan sought shortcuts to make up for the aircraft carriers lost at Midway. Mogami's 2 aft turrets were removed, and her aircraft deck extended all the way to the stern. She received new air search radar and more anti-aircraft weapons. She could now operate 11 seaplanes, which could be used for fighter or reconnaissance missions. She rammed the oiler Toa Maru on May 22, 1943, after being out of dry dock for less than a month, but this time the damage was minimal. A few months later, on November 5, 1943, she arrived in Rabaul just when aircraft from the carrier Saratoga conducted a raid on the harbor. One of Saratoga's dive bombers slammed a 500-pound bomb between Mogami's 2 forward turrets, starting a severe fire. Both magazines had to be flooded by the damage control crew, submerging the cruiser's bow. After a month of emergency repairs in Truk, Mogami traveled to the Kure Navy Yard in Japan for comprehensive repairs. In February 1944, after her repairs were finished, she departed Kure Dockyard for her new base in Borneo. When the Americans invaded the Philippines on October 20, 1944, Mogami was assigned to the southern part of a pincer attack on the American invasion fleet off the island of Leyte. The complex plan called for the Imperial Japanese Navy's remaining carriers to make a demonstration off the Philippines in order to draw American carriers away from the invasion fleet, giving the battleships the opportunity to attack the undefended American transports off Leyte. The Northern Task Force was to proceed through the San Bernardino Strait, while the Southern Task Force, under Nishimura, was to proceed through the Surigao Strait. Nishimura's Southern Task Force consisted of 2 First World War battleships, the Fuso and Yamashiro, the heavy cruiser Mogami, and 4 destroyers. They would be supported by another squadron, consisting of 2 heavy cruisers and 1 light cruiser, following a few hours behind. Nishimura's ships were attacked by carrier aircraft as they steamed from Brunei Bay toward Leyte Gulf on October 22. Although the airstrikes did not hinder the Japanese advance, they did inform the Americans of Nishimura's whereabouts. Rear Admiral Oldendorf positioned his ships in a huge semicircle at the strait's mouth, using Surigao Strait's narrow geography to channel the Japanese warships into an ambush. Nishimura's task force would first encounter patrol torpedo boats, then destroyers, and finally a battle line of 6 battleships, 4 heavy cruisers, and 4 light cruisers. Nishimura's force entered Surigao Strait shortly after midnight on October 25, 1944, and was spotted by PT boats, which harried the Japanese while reporting their position. The Fuso mistook the helpless Mogami for an American ship during the chaotic firefight. The battleship fired at the Mogami with its 6-inch guns, striking her twice before Nishimura gave the order to stop firing and regrouped his ships with the battleships leading and the Mogami following. At 2:58 a.m., American destroyers launched a devastating assault, firing 27 torpedoes at the advancing Japanese fleet. The torpedoes tore apart Fuso and 2 destroyers and damaged a 3rd destroyer. While Fuso ground to a halt before sinking, Nishimura, aboard his flagship Yamashiro, with Mogami following him, pressed on, dodging American torpedoes. What was left of Nishimura's force struck the American main battle line at 3:53 a.m., feeling the full force of the 16-inch and 14-inch shells from the American battleships as well as the cacophony of 8-inch and 6-inch guns from the American cruisers, which lit up the night and slammed down on the Japanese ships. The vast majority of American shells detonated on Yamashiro, setting her on fire. Not until illuminated by Yamashiro's fires, was Mogami spotted by 2 destroyers which opened fire. Without the benefit of radar like the American ships, Mogami had to resort to 2 large searchlights to identify her targets, which drew a hail of 8 and 6-inch shells from Oldendorf's cruisers. At 4:02 a.m., after being severely damaged by earlier hits, Mogami received a direct hit to the bridge that killed all of the important officers on board and left the ship, drifting aimlessly with no one in charge. Petty Officer Yamamoto ran onto the smashed bridge to find the steering mechanism inoperable. As Mogami retired from the action, American guns and torpedoes sent Yamashiro to the bottom, capping the last duel between battleships in history. Mogami and the destroyer Shigeru were now the only vessels of Nishimura's force left afloat, both of which were retreating in an effort to survive. At 4:15 a.m., lookouts aboard Mogami spotted ships racing toward them at 30 knots. It was the backup squadron trying to catch up with the now non-existent main force. Not realizing that the Mogami was steering by engine, the captain of heavy cruiser Nachi thought he could pass Mogami close by. Too late, he realized that Mogami was heading right for him. At 4:23 a.m., the 2 ships collided with a jarring crunch. The Nachi fared worse, suffering a 15-meter gash in the port bow, just below the waterline. Flood alarms went off on board the Nachi as the 2 cruisers pulled themselves apart. At 4:41 a.m., knowing they were facing impossible odds, the senior commander decided it was time to withdraw. The still-burning Mogami, which was retreating slowly at 20 knots, sustained an explosion when 4 of her torpedoes ignited, increasing the carnage on board. The American cruisers pursued cautiously, scoring several long-range hits on the Mogami. With fires raging out of control and only 1 engine room still operational, she was astonishingly still able to maintain 14 knots. By 5:45 a.m., dawn had broken, bringing with it American airstrikes. 21 Avenger torpedo bombers swooped in to attack the Mogami, scoring 3 torpedo hits, which finally brought her to a halt. With the aid of a long lance torpedo to assist her on her way, Mogami slid beneath the waves at 1:07 p.m. Nachi made it to Manila for repairs caused by the collision. She was still there when, on November 5th, 4 waves of airstrikes tore Nachi apart, taking 807 men to the bottom of Manila Bay with her. Nachi's demise, like that of the Mikuma 2.5 years earlier, was a direct result of the collision with Mogami, adding a final stain to Mogami's unfortunate career. If you liked this video, there are many similar high-quality videos on my channel.